Hey guys, tonight we wander into a version of history that feels familiar, but slowly begins to slip through your fingers like sand. You're walking through a dimly lit hallway lined with old paintings, dusty books, and whispered stories you've heard your whole life, stories that feel solid, unquestionable, almost comforting. But here's the thing, some of them aren't real. Or at least, not in the way you think. And don't worry, you probably won't survive this, not because anything scary will jump out at you, but because once you start noticing the cracks in history, you can't unsee them. Your brain just keeps going, wait, what else is wrong? So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, drop a comment with your location and the local time where you are right now. There's something oddly comforting about knowing who else is awake, drifting through this strange little journey with you. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You move closer to one of the shelves. The books look ancient, their pages yellowed, their spines cracked just enough to suggest they've been opened many times, but not always questioned. That's the thing about history. You don't experience it directly. You inherit it. Passed down like a story told around a fire, retold, reshaped, simplified, until eventually, it becomes something that feels true even if it isn't entirely accurate. You run your fingers along the edge of a book, and it almost feels like it hums beneath your touch. Every story inside claims to tell you what happened. But how do you really know? Because here's a quiet, slightly unsettling truth: history isn't just a collection of facts. It's a collection of narratives. And narratives, well, they are crafted by people. People who forget things. People who exaggerate things. People who sometimes just make things up. You pause, letting that sink in. Somewhere along the way, stories get cleaned up. Messy details disappear. Heroes become a little more heroic. Villains become easier to hate. Uncomplicated events get turned into neat, easy-to-remember versions. It's kind of like when someone tells you about their day. The first time, it's detailed. The second time, it's shorter. By the fifth time, it's basically a highlight reel. Now imagine that process happening over hundreds, sometimes thousands, of years. Yeah. Things start to shift. A faint breeze passes through the hallway even though there are no windows open. The pages of a nearby book flutter slightly, almost like they are breathing. You pick one up. Inside, you find something familiar. A story you've heard before. Maybe in school. Maybe in a documentary. Maybe in one of those late-night rabbit holes you fall into when you can't sleep. It feels solid. Recognizable. Safe. But then, you notice a small detail. Something that doesn't quite add up. And that's where it starts. That tiny moment of doubt. Because once you question one thing, it's hard not to question everything. You begin to realize that history isn't lying to you on purpose, not always, at least. It's more subtle than that. It's shaped by culture, by politics, by whoever had the power to write things down, and more importantly, by whoever got remembered. There's actually a well-known historical idea, though it's often simplified, that history is written by the victors. It's not entirely wrong. When one side wins, they get to tell the story. And when they tell it, they tend to make themselves look a little better. Or a lot better. And the other side, their version fades. Sometimes it disappears completely. You close the book slowly. Some way in the distance, you hear a faint echo, like footsteps, or maybe just your imagination filling in the silence. You're not alone in this hallway. Not really. You're surrounded by voices. Historians, storytellers, scribes, teachers, all layering their interpretations over time. Each one adding a brushstroke to a painting that never quite stays the same. Scholars still argue whether we can ever truly know the real version of many historical events, or if what we have is just the best approximation, filtered through bias and time. And that's kind of comforting and kind of unsettling, because it means the past isn't as fixed as it seems. You glance at another shelf. This one feels heavier somehow. The titles are more dramatic. Bigger claims. Bigger stories. The kind that stick in your memory. These are the myths. Not complete fabrications, but not exactly truth either. Stories that started with a grain of reality and then grew. And grew. Until they became something almost unrecognizable from their origins. You pull one out at random. The cover is bold, almost theatrical. You don't even need to read the title to know it's one of those stories everyone knows. The kind people repeat without thinking. The kind that shows up in textbooks, documentaries, even movies. And yet, something about it feels off. There's a strange detail tucked inside. Something small, almost easy to miss. But once you see it, it refuses to go away. A date that doesn't match. A quote that no one can trace. A dramatic moment that sounds a little too perfect. It's like the story wants to be believed. And maybe that's the point. Because humans love stories that make sense. Stories with clear beginnings, middles, and ends. Stories that teach lessons or confirm what we already think we know. The truth, on the other hand, is messy. It's full of contradictions, unfinished threads, missing pieces. And honestly, it's not always as entertaining. You lean back slightly, letting your eyes adjust to the dim light. The hallway feels longer now. Deeper. Like it stretches further than it did before. You realize this isn't just about one myth. It's about a pattern. A pattern where stories slowly drift away from reality, not because of some grand conspiracy, but because of something much simpler. Repetition. The more a story is told, the more it settles into place. It becomes familiar. And familiarity feels like truth. Even when it isn't. You take a slow breath. Tonight, you're not just listening to history. You're peeling it apart. Layer by layer. Story by story. And with each one, you're going to notice something strange. Something slightly off. Something that makes you pause and think. Wait, did that really happen like that? By the time you reach the end of this journey, you might not look at history the same way again. Not because it's fake, but because it's human. And humans? We're really, really good at telling stories. Even the ones that never quite happened. You drift a little further down the hallway, and the air feels cooler here, quieter, like this part of history is holding its breath. A single shelf stands apart from the others. It's larger, heavier, almost intimidating in its presence. The books here don't just tell stories, they carry legends. The kind of stories that feel too big to question. Your eyes settle on one name almost instantly. Alexandria. You've heard this before. Everyone has. The Great Library of Alexandria, one of the most famous centers of knowledge in human history. A place where countless scrolls were stored, where scholars gathered, where the wisdom of the ancient world was preserved, until, one night, it all went up in flames. Gone. Just like that. A single catastrophic event, a tragic loss. The moment humanity supposedly forgot centuries of knowledge. It's a powerful image, isn't it? You can almost see it, the fire spreading through endless shelves, scrolls curling into ash, scholars desperately trying to save what they can, the glow of flames lighting up the night sky. It feels real, too real. You pull the book out slowly, almost expecting it to be warm to the touch. But as you open it, something feels different. The story doesn't unfold the way you expect. Because here's the strange part. There's no clear evidence that the Great Library of Alexandria was destroyed in one single, dramatic event. Yeah, I know. That already sounds wrong. You've probably heard that it was burned down, maybe by Julius Caesar during his campaign in Egypt. That's one of the most common versions. Around 48 BCE, Caesar's troops set fire to ships in the harbor, and the flames supposedly spread to the library. It's neat, it's dramatic, it makes sense, but historians aren't so sure. Some ancient sources do mention fires in Alexandria during Caesar's time. That part is real. But whether the library itself was destroyed in that fire, that's where things get fuzzy. Scholars still argue whether the damage was limited to nearby warehouses storing scrolls, or if the main library was even affected at all. You tilt your head slightly. So if it wasn't Caesar, then who? Well, that's where the story gets even messier. Over the centuries, Alexandria went through multiple periods of conflict. There were riots, invasions, political shifts, each one leaving its mark on the city. Some accounts suggest the library declined gradually rather than disappearing overnight. A slow fading, instead of a sudden end. You turn another page, there's mention of later events, like the rise of Christianity in the Roman Empire. Some historians believe that during this time, pagan institutions, including parts of the library, may have been targeted or neglected. Then there's another story, one involving the Muslim conquest of Alexandria in the 7th century. A much later tale claims that the library was destroyed on the orders of a caliph, who supposedly said that if the books agreed with the Quran, they were unnecessary, and if they disagreed, they were dangerous. It's dramatic, almost cinematic, and yet, there's a problem. That story only appears in sources written hundreds of years after the supposed event. No contemporary evidence, no direct accounts, which makes it suspicious. You close the book halfway, your fingers resting between the pages. So what actually happened? The most likely answer is not very satisfying. The Great Library of Alexandria probably didn't vanish in a single night of fire and chaos. Instead, it slowly declined over time. Funding may have dried up. Political support may have shifted. Scrolls may have been lost, damaged, or simply not replaced. Different parts of the library system, because it wasn't just one building, may have been destroyed at different times. It's less dramatic, but more realistic. And yet, that's not the version most people remember. Because the idea of a single, catastrophic event is just better storytelling. One moment, one tragedy, one clear thing to point to and say, that's when we lost it all. It gives the story weight, emotion, a sense of finality, a slow decline. That's harder to picture, harder to feel. You lean against the shelf slightly, the wood creaking just a bit under the pressure. It's interesting, isn't it? How we take something complex and turn it into something simple. How we compress years, sometimes centuries, into a single moment. Because it's easier that way. Easier to remember, easier to teach, and maybe easier to mourn. You glance back at the image forming in your mind. The towering shelves, the roaring fire, the sense of sudden loss. Even now, knowing what you know, it still feels real. That's the power of a good story. There's also a quirky little detail you might not have heard before. The Great Library wasn't just one place. It was actually part of a larger network of institutions, including something called the Mauseon, a kind of research center or scholarly community. Think of it less like a modern library and more like a combination of university, archive, and think tank. Which means even if one part was damaged, knowledge didn't just disappear instantly. It was more spread out than the legend suggests. But again, that version doesn't hit as hard, does it? You take a slow breath, letting the quiet settle around you. Somewhere in the distance, that faint echo returns, like pages turning on their own. You realize this story isn't just about a library. It's about how we process loss. We like to believe that there was a single moment when everything changed. A clear before and after. A line in time we can point to. But reality rarely works like that. It's gradual, uneven, complicated, and sometimes things don't end with a bang. They just fade. You gently slide the book back into place. The shelf feels a little less intimidating now. Not because the story is less important, but because it's more human than you expected. Messy, uncertain, open to interpretation, just like everything else in this hallway. As you step away, you can't help but think about all the other stories you've heard. The ones that feel just as solid, just as unquestionable. How many of them were built the same way? How many of them have been simplified, reshaped, turned into something easier to believe? You already know the answer, probably more than you'd like, and as you move forward, deeper into the dim light, you can feel it, that quiet shift in perspective. The realization that history isn't just about what happened, it's about what we think happened, and those two things aren't always the same. You keep moving, your footsteps softer now, almost instinctively quieter, like you've realized this place isn't just filled with stories, it's filled with assumptions. The next shelf doesn't look as ancient. The books here feel more familiar, almost modern in comparison. Names you recognize instantly, figures you've seen in textbooks, memes, documentaries, maybe even jokes. And one of those jokes comes to mind almost immediately. Napoleon Bonaparte, the tiny emperor. You've heard it before, right? The image is almost automatic. A short, angry man with a hand tucked into his coat, stomping around Europe with a bit too much attitude for his height. It's one of those historical facts people throw around casually, like it's common knowledge. You reach for the book, already half smiling, because this one feels obvious. Of course Napoleon was short. Everyone says that. But as you open the pages, that familiar feeling returns. That slight discomfort, that quiet little voice going, wait, because Napoleon wasn't actually that short. Yeah, let that sit for a second. Historically, Napoleon's height is recorded as around 5 feet 6 or 5 feet 7 inches. Now, depending on where you are, that might sound average, maybe even a bit short by today's standards. But here's the thing, in early 19th century Europe, that was completely normal. In fact, it was slightly above average for French men at the time. So how did he end up with this reputation? You lean a little closer, flipping through the pages. Part of the confusion comes from something surprisingly simple, measurement systems. When Napoleon's height was recorded, it was written in French units, pieds and pouces. But when those measurements were later converted into English units, something got lost in translation. The French inch was slightly longer than the British inch. So when people converted his height directly without adjusting for the difference, Napoleon suddenly shrank. Not physically, of course, just on paper. And once that version spread, it stuck. But that's not the only reason. There's another layer to this, a more human one. During Napoleon's time, he had a lot of enemies, especially in Britain. And if there's one thing people have always been good at, it's making fun of their rivals. British propaganda often depicted Napoleon as small, childish, even ridiculous. Cartoons exaggerated his features, shrunk his stature, and turned him into something almost comical. Because it's easier to dismiss someone if you can make them look small. Literally, you can almost picture it, newspapers, pamphlets, exaggerated drawings circulating through cities. People laughing, repeating the joke, passing it along. And over time, the joke became truth. You pause for a moment. It's kind of strange, isn't it? A global historical figure, reduced to a stereotype because of a mix of measurement confusion and a few well-placed jokes. And yet, Even now, if you ask someone about Napoleon, there's a good chance they'll mention his height. That detail survived, not his administrative reforms, not his legal code, not even his military strategies. His height, or at least the myth of it. There's actually a mainstream historical fact hidden beneath all this. Napoleon was one of the most influential leaders in European history. His Napoleonic Code still influences legal systems today in various parts of the world. But somehow, that gets overshadowed by the idea that he was short. You let out a quiet breath, almost amused. History can be weird like that. The smallest details, sometimes the least accurate ones, become the most memorable. And here's a quirky little twist. Napoleon was often surrounded by his imperial guard, elite soldiers who were, on average, taller than regular troops, so when people saw him standing next to them, he appeared shorter by comparison. It's like standing next to a group of basketball players and suddenly questioning your entire existence. Perspective matters a lot. You close the book slightly, your thumb still holding your place. Scholars still argue whether Napoleon himself was sensitive about his height or if that idea was exaggerated later. There's no clear evidence that he had what we now jokingly call a Napoleon complex. In fact, many accounts describe him as confident, commanding, even intimidating in presence. Not exactly what you'd expect from someone constantly insecure about being too short. You step back from the shelf, letting the idea settle in your mind. It's not just that the story is wrong, it's how easily it became right in people's minds. A small misunderstanding, a bit of propaganda, a dash of repetition, and suddenly, you have a fact. It makes you wonder how many other details like this are floating around. Tiny distortions that don't seem like a big deal, but completely change how we see someone. Because once a label sticks, it's hard to remove. You still picture him, don't you? Hand in coat, slightly grumpy, a little shorter than he should be. Even now, knowing the truth, that image doesn't fully go away. That's the power of repetition. You glance down the hallway again. It feels longer than before, deeper, like every step is taking you further away from certainty and closer to something more fluid. More uncertain, but also more real. Because if history were perfectly accurate, perfectly preserved, it might actually feel less human. Less relatable. Instead, it's filled with these little distortions, these odd quirks, these moments where reality and storytelling blur together. And sometimes, it takes something as simple as a measuring error to remind you of that. You gently slide the book back into place. Napoleon stays where he is, somewhere between fact and myth, taller than people think, but still standing in the shadow of a joke that refused to fade. As you move forward, you can't help but feel a quiet curiosity building. If something as basic as height can be misunderstood for centuries, what else have we been getting wrong? You move on, a little slower now, like you've started to enjoy this quiet unraveling of things you once took for granted. The next shelf feels colder somehow, not physically, but visually. The covers are darker, filled with images of storms, ships, axes, and men with wild beards staring out into the distance. Vikings, and almost instantly, your mind fills in the details. Fur cloaks, long ships cutting through icy water, battle cries echoing across the sea, and of course, those iconic horned helmets. It's such a strong image that it barely feels worth questioning. You can practically see them, massive horns curving upward, making them look even more intimidating, almost mythical. But then, that quiet voice returns. Wait, you reach for one of the books, already suspecting what you're about to find. And sure enough, the horns don't belong there. Historically speaking, Vikings did not wear horned helmets in battle. Yeah, not even a little. You pause, letting that sink in, because this one feels personal somehow. Like finding out a character you've known your whole life has been wearing the wrong costume. Actual Viking helmets, at least the ones archaeologists have found, are much simpler. Practical, rounded iron caps, sometimes with a nose guard, designed for protection, not decoration. No horns, no dramatic spikes, nothing that would make it easier for an enemy to grab your head mid-fight. Because, let's be honest, wearing horns into battle is not exactly a great survival strategy. You tilt your head slightly, imagining it. You charge into combat, adrenaline pumping, and suddenly someone just grabs your helmet and yanks you sideways like a shopping cart with a broken wheel. Yeah, not ideal. So where did the horns come from? You flip a few pages, and the answer is surprisingly theatrical. The horned Viking helmet is largely a 19th century invention. More specifically, it became popular through costume design in operas, especially the works of Richard Wagner. When Wagner's epic operas about Norse mythology were performed, the costume designers wanted something visually striking. Something that would instantly signal, these are fierce, ancient warriors. And horns. Horns looked cool, dramatic, memorable, larger than life, so they added them, and the audience loved it. The image stuck. Over time, it spread beyond the stage, into illustrations, books, later into films, cartoons, video games, until eventually it became the default mental picture of a Viking. Even though it was never historically accurate, you lean back slightly, a faint smile forming. It's kind of amazing, isn't it? An entire visual identity built on a costume choice. There were some ancient cultures that used horned helmets, but usually for ceremonial or symbolic purposes, not actual combat. And not in the way we imagine Vikings. But once the image took hold, it didn't matter. Because it felt right. It matched the story. Fierce warriors, harsh landscapes, mythological vibes. Horns just completed the look. There's a mainstream historical fact here too. Vikings were skilled sailors, traders, and explorers, not just raiders. They traveled as far as North America, centuries before Columbus, and established complex societies. But again, that part often gets overshadowed, because it's easier to remember the aesthetic, the stereotype, the visual. You run your fingers lightly along the edge of the page. There's also a quirky detail hidden in this myth. Some early depictions of horned Vikings might have been influenced by misinterpretations of older artifacts, like Bronze Age helmets found in Scandinavia that did have horn-like structures. But those were from a completely different time period, long before the Viking Age. It's like mixing up two completely different movies just because they have similar costumes. Easy mistake, if you're not paying close attention. Scholars still argue whether these visual myths spread purely through entertainment or if they also reflect a deeper human tendency to exaggerate the past, to make it more dramatic, more symbolic. Because plain reality sometimes feels a bit underwhelming, you close the book gently. For a moment, you try to picture a Viking without the horns. Just a simple helmet, practical, functional. It feels quieter, less dramatic, but also more real. And that's the trade-off, isn't it? Accuracy versus imagination. Somewhere along the way, we chose imagination. Not deliberately, not consciously, just naturally. Because stories evolve, images stick, and over time, those images become inseparable from the people they represent. Even when they're wrong, you take a slow breath, the faint hum of the hallway settling back in around you. It's getting easier now, spotting the pattern. A small addition here, a slight exaggeration there, a detail that makes the story more vivid but less accurate. And before you know it, the original version is buried underneath layers of interpretation. You glance back one last time at the shelf. The horned helmets are still there, in your mind, at least. They'll probably always be there. Because once an image becomes iconic, it doesn't just disappear. It lingers, even when you know better. You step forward again, deeper into the dim corridor, where more stories wait, quietly, patiently, ready to be questioned. You move further down the corridor, and something shifts. The air feels wider here. Lesson closed. Like the story you're about to step into isn't just about one place, it's about an entire world. Maps begin to appear along the walls. Old ones, faded coastlines, strange shapes, sea monsters curling around the edges like warnings. You recognize the style instantly, the kind of maps that make the past feel mysterious, unfinished. And at the center of it all, one name quietly rises above the rest. Columbus. It's a story you've probably heard since childhood. In 1492, Christopher Columbus sailed across the ocean and discovered America. Simple, clean, memorable, almost too perfect. You reach for the nearest book, your fingers brushing against its worn cover. There's a sense of familiarity here, but also that now familiar doubt creeping in again. Because here's the thing, Columbus didn't actually discover America. Not in the way the story is usually told. You open the book slowly. The first thing you notice is a date that doesn't match the narrative in your head. Long before Columbus ever set sail, the Americas were already inhabited by millions of people. Entire civilizations, complex, advanced, deeply rooted in their own histories, were living, building, trading, and evolving across the continents. They weren't waiting to be discovered. They were already there, thriving. It's a quiet realization, but it changes everything. Because suddenly, the word discover doesn't quite fit anymore. You turn another page. There's also evidence that other explorers reached parts of the Americas before Columbus. The most commonly accepted example, the Norse explorer Leif Erikson, around the year 1000, nearly 500 years before Columbus. Leif Erikson is believed to have landed in what is now Newfoundland, Canada. Archaeological sites like Lonceau Meadows support this. So even from a European perspective, Columbus wasn't first. And yet, his name is the one that stuck. You pause, letting that settle in. So why? Why is Columbus still credited in so many textbooks, stories, and cultural references? You flip a few more pages, and the answer begins to take shape. Columbus's voyage in 1492 wasn't the first time someone reached the Americas. But it was the moment that triggered sustained contact between Europe and the New World. It opened the door to exploration, colonization, trade, and unfortunately, conquest and destruction as well. In a way, it marked the beginning of a new global era. And that made it significant. But somewhere along the way, significant became first. And first became discovered. You lean back slightly, absorbing the weight of that shift. It's subtle, just a change in wording, but it completely reshapes the story. There's a mainstream historical fact here that's often simplified. Columbus was actually trying to find a westward route to Asia, not a new continent. He believed he had reached parts of the East Indies, which is why he referred to the indigenous people as Indians. He never fully realized he had encountered an entirely separate landmass, which makes the story even more complicated. You can't help but smile a little at the irony. The man famous for discovering America didn't even know what he had found. There's also a quirky detail tucked into this narrative. Columbus made multiple voyages, 4 in total, but he never set foot on the mainland of what we now call the United States. His journeys mostly took him to Caribbean islands and parts of Central and South America. So the version you might picture, him stepping onto a vast new continent and claiming it in one dramatic moment, is a bit misleading. More simplification, more storytelling. Scholars still argue whether Columbus should be remembered primarily as an explorer, a symbol of cultural exchange, or a figure associated with the darker consequences of colonization. Because history, again, isn't one-dimensional. It depends on perspective. You close the book halfway, your thumb resting on the edge of the page. It's interesting how this story is taught. Clean lines, clear roles, a beginning that feels almost like a fairy tale. But when you look closer, it's layered, messy, filled with overlapping timelines and perspectives that don't fit neatly together. And yet, the simplified version persists. Because it's easier. Easier to teach. Easier to remember. Easier to fit into a single sentence. Columbus discovered America. 4 words. But behind those 4 words is an entire world of nuance that gets quietly pushed aside. You glance at the maps again. They look different now. Not empty. Not waiting to be filled. But already alive with movement, culture, and history, long before any European ships appeared on the horizon. It makes you rethink the idea of discovery itself. Can you really discover something that's already inhabited? Or is it more accurate to say, you arrived, encountered, interrupted? The words matter, more than we realize. You take a slow breath, the soft hum of the hallway wrapping around you again. This pattern, it's becoming clearer with every step. Stories get simplified, details get adjusted, language gets convenient, and over time, those adjustments become the version everyone knows. Even if they're not entirely true. You gently place the book back on the shelf. Columbus remains there, somewhere between legend and reality, between achievement and controversy, between the story you were told and the one you're now beginning to see more clearly. As you move forward, the corridor stretches on, filled with more names, more events, more facts, waiting to be questioned. And now, you're ready for them, because once you've seen how one story shifts, it's impossible not to notice the rest. You keep walking, but something feels different now. The hallway narrows slightly, the air growing heavier, like the next story isn't just misunderstood, it's layered in something older, something almost mythological. The shelves here are carved, not built. The wood is darker, etched with symbols that look ancient, deliberate. You run your fingers across one of them, and for a moment, it feels like you're stepping into a story that was never meant to be taken literally. And yet, everyone does. Your eyes land on a familiar name, Troy. You don't even need to think about it. The image forms instantly. A massive wooden horse, towering walls, soldiers hidden inside, waiting silently as the gates of the city open, unaware of what's about to happen. The Trojan horse, one of the most famous moments in all of history, or at least, that's how it's usually presented. You reach for the book, curiosity already pulling you in, because something about this story has always felt too perfect, too clever, too cinematic, and sure enough, as you open the pages, the certainty begins to fade. Here's the truth, we don't actually know if the Trojan horse was real. Yeah, that legendary trick, the giant wooden horse filled with soldiers sneaking into Troy, might not have happened the way you've always imagined. Or, at all. You pause, letting that settle. Because this one feels different from the others. It's not just a misunderstanding or a small exaggeration. It's a story that exists right on the edge of myth and history. Most of what we know about the Trojan War comes from ancient Greek literature, especially epic poems like the Iliad and the Odyssey, traditionally attributed to Homer. But here's the thing, these weren't written as historical records. They were stories, epic, poetic, dramatic stories passed down through oral tradition before being written down. Which means they were shaped, retold, embellished, over generations. And while they may be based on real events, separating fact from fiction becomes complicated. Very complicated. You flip a page slowly. Archaeologists have actually found evidence of a city that could be ancient Troy, located in modern-day Turkey. And there are signs that it was destroyed at some point in history. So the war itself, possibly real, but the details, that's where things get blurry. Scholars still argue whether the Trojan horse was a literal object, a symbolic story, or something else entirely. Some theories suggest that the horse might have been a metaphor, perhaps for a siege engine, like a battering ram, or even for an earthquake. In ancient symbolism, horses were sometimes associated with gods of earthquakes. Imagine that, the horse not as a physical object, but as a poetic way of describing the destruction of the city. It changes the entire story. You lean back slightly, picturing it. No giant wooden structure, No hidden soldiers waiting in silence. Just a city under siege, eventually falling, and later storytellers turning that fall into something more dramatic. More memorable, because again, humans love a good story. And what's better than a clever trick? A moment of deception so brilliant that it feels almost legendary. You can see why it stuck. There's also a quirky detail hidden in this myth. The original stories never give a precise description of the horse's size or construction. The image we have today, the massive, towering structure, is mostly shaped by later art, literature, and modern interpretations. It grew over time, just like everything else. You close the book halfway, your mind still holding onto the image. Even now, knowing it might not be real, it feels real. That's the strange part, because some stories are so deeply embedded in culture that they stop being questioned. They become symbols. The Trojan horse isn't just a story anymore, it's a metaphor. A phrase we still use today to describe hidden threats or deceptive strategies. It lives on, even if its origins are uncertain. There's also a mainstream historical fact woven into all of this. Ancient Greek literature played a massive role in shaping Western storytelling traditions. These epics weren't meant to be documentaries, they were meant to entertain, to teach, to inspire. And they did, incredibly well. But somewhere along the way, we started treating parts of them as literal history. You take a slow breath, the quiet of the hallway pressing in just a little closer. It's interesting how this keeps happening. A story begins as something symbolic, poetic, maybe even exaggerated on purpose. And over time, it hardens into something that feels factual, something unquestioned, until someone pauses and asks, "Did this really happen like that?" You glance back at the carved symbols on the shelf. They don't feel like decorations anymore. They feel like reminders that history isn't always written in straight lines. Sometimes it's told in metaphors, in stories that blur the line between reality and imagination. And sometimes, those stories become more powerful than the truth itself. You gently slide the book back into place. The Trojan horse remains, half legend, half possibility, entirely unforgettable. And as you step forward again, deeper into the corridor, you can't help but feel a quiet shift inside you. You're no longer just listening to these stories, you're questioning them, and that changes everything. You move forward again, and the atmosphere shifts in a way that's hard to explain. The hallway feels tighter here, not physically, but emotionally. Like the air itself carries tension. The shelves are closer together, the lighting dimmer, and there's a faint uneasiness that wasn't there before. You notice something else too. Whispers, not loud, not clear, just there, like fragments of voices caught between pages. Your eyes land on a name you've heard many times before, Salem, and instantly, a story begins to form in your mind. Dark forests, accusations shouted in crowded rooms, fear spreading like wildfire, dozens, maybe hundreds, of innocent people being hunted down, tortured, burned. Burned at the stake, that's the image most people carry. The Salem witch trials is a kind of chaotic nightmare where anyone could be accused and punished in the most brutal ways imaginable. You reach for the book slowly, almost hesitating, because this one feels heavy, real, but as you open it, the story begins to shift. Not disappear, just change. Because here's something that might surprise you. No one was burned at the stake during the Salem witch trials. You pause. That detail alone feels off, like a piece of the story just quietly slipped out of place. The executions did happen, that part is true, but they weren't carried out the way most people imagine. In 1692, in colonial Massachusetts, a series of accusations led to the trial of dozens of people accused of witchcraft. Fear spread quickly, suspicion grew, and in the end, 20 people were executed. 19 were hanged. One man, Giles Corey, was pressed to death under heavy stones. It's grim, quietly brutal, but not the fiery spectacle often associated with witch trials. That image, the burning stakes, the roaring flames, that actually comes more from European witch hunts, not Salem specifically. And yet, somehow, the two got blended together. You lean slightly against the shelf, the wood cool beneath your fingertips. It's easy to see how it happened. When people think of witch trials, they imagine the most extreme version of it. Fire, chaos, hysteria. And Salem, being one of the most famous cases, gets wrapped into that imagery. Even if it doesn't quite fit, you turn another page, there's more here that doesn't match the common story. For example, the idea that the trials were completely random, that anyone could be accused at any moment without reason. While it's true that fear played a huge role, many of the accusations were influenced by existing tensions in the community. Personal disputes, family rivalries, property disagreements. It wasn't just blind chaos. It was human, messy, complicated human behavior amplified by fear. Scholars still argue whether the events in Salem were driven primarily by religious extremism, social tensions, psychological factors, or even environmental causes like ergot poisoning, a fungus that can contaminate grain and potentially cause hallucination-like symptoms. There's no single answer, just layers of possibility. You let that settle in, because it makes the story feel less like a sudden outbreak of madness and more like a slow build of pressure that eventually snapped. There's also a quirky detail tucked into this narrative. Many of the initial accusers were young girls, and their behavior, fits, strange movements, claims of visions, played a major role in convincing others that something supernatural was happening. Imagine being in that environment. No modern science to explain unusual behavior. A deeply religious community already wary of the supernatural. And suddenly, multiple people claiming to be afflicted by unseen forces. It would feel real, terrifyingly real. You close the book halfway, your mind replaying the scene. Even without the flames, it's unsettling. Maybe even more so, because it feels grounded, possible. There's a mainstream historical fact here that often gets simplified. The Salem witch trials were eventually recognized as a mistake. In the years that followed, many of the convictions were overturned, and compensation was given to the families of the accused. An official acknowledgement that something went wrong, that the system failed. But that part of the story doesn't always get as much attention. Because it's quieter, less dramatic. You glance around the hallway again. The whispers feel softer now. Less chaotic, more like echoes than cries. It's interesting how the human mind works. We tend to remember the most extreme version of events, the most dramatic imagery, the details that leave the strongest impression, even if those details aren't entirely accurate, especially if they aren't, because they make the story more vivid, more memorable. You take a slow breath, letting the tension ease just a little. The Salem witch trials weren't exactly what you thought they were. Not as fiery, not as random, not as simple, but still, deeply human. Filled with fear, misunderstanding, and the kind of decisions people make when they're overwhelmed and searching for answers. You gently slide the book back into place. The shelf feels quieter now, less haunted by myth, more grounded in reality. And as you step forward again, you can feel it, that subtle shift happening inside you. The realization that even the darkest stories aren't always told the way they actually happened. And sometimes, the truth is just as unsettling. You move on, and the tension slowly softens. The hallway opens up again, warmer this time, almost elegant. The shelves here are lighter, polished, decorated with gold accents and delicate patterns. Portraits hang between them, soft smiles, powdered wigs, elaborate gowns. Royalty. There's a calmness here, but also something else, a quiet sense of judgment. Like every face on these walls has already been turned into a story. A symbol, a lesson, and one name, in particular, seems to echo louder than the rest. Marie Antoinette. You already know the line. Let them eat cake. It's one of the most famous quotes in history. A perfect example of arrogance, indifference, and the disconnect between rulers and the people they govern. You can almost hear it being said, lightly, dismissively, as if hunger itself were a trivial inconvenience. But as you reach for the book, that familiar feeling returns. Because something about it has always felt too perfect, too neatly symbolic. You open the pages slowly, and almost immediately, the illusion begins to crack. Marie Antoinette never said, "Let them eat cake." Yeah, that line, so famous, so widely repeated, has no solid historical evidence linking it to her. You pause, letting the silence settle, because this one feels strange. It's not just a misunderstanding. It's a quote that defines a person that she'd probably never even said. You turn a page. The phrase actually appears in earlier writings, most notably in the works of Jean-Jacques Rousseau. In his Confessions, written before Marie Antoinette even became Queen of France, Rousseau mentions a story about a great princess who, when told that peasants had no bread, replied, "Qu'ils mangent de la brioche," which translates roughly to, "Let them eat cake." But here's the key detail. Rousseau never names the princess. And at the time he wrote it, Marie Antoinette was still a child. Not even in France yet. You let that sink in. So how did the quote end up attached to her? You flip another page, the answer slowly unfolding. During the years leading up to the French Revolution, Marie Antoinette became a symbol of excess and royal detachment. Whether fair or not, she was often portrayed as out of touch with the struggles of ordinary people. Pamphlets, rumors, political propaganda, all contributed to shaping her image. And the quote, it fit perfectly, too perfectly. It captured everything people wanted to believe about her in one simple, memorable line. So it stuck. You lean back slightly, your eyes drifting toward one of the portraits on the wall. She doesn't look cruel. She doesn't look indifferent. She looks human. And that's the uncomfortable part. Because history often turns people into symbols, heroes, villains, cautionary tales, but real people are rarely that simple. There's a mainstream historical fact here that often gets overshadowed. Marie Antoinette was a controversial figure, yes, but her role in France's financial crisis was limited. Many of the country's economic problems were deeply rooted in long-standing issues, including debt from wars and an unequal tax system. But complexity doesn't always make for a compelling story. Simplicity does. A single quote, a single moment, a single image that defines everything. You run your fingers lightly along the edge of the page. There's also a quirky detail hidden in this myth. The word brioche doesn't just mean cake. It refers to a specific type of rich bread made with butter and eggs. So even the translation we commonly use isn't entirely accurate. It's like the story has been filtered multiple times. First through rumor, then through politics, then through language, each layer adding a little distortion. Scholars still argue whether the quote was ever actually spoken by any royal figure at all, or if it was simply a fictional anecdote used to criticize the elite. Either way, by the time it reached Marie Antoinette, it had already taken on a life of its own. You close the book halfway, your mind lingering on the phrase, "Let them eat cake." Even now, knowing the truth, it still carries weight. It still feels like it belongs to her. That's the strange power of repetition. A quote doesn't have to be real to become real in people's minds. It just has to be believable. In this one, it was perfectly believable. You glance around the room again. The portraits seem quieter now. Less like symbols, more like individuals caught in a story that grew beyond them. It makes you wonder how many other words, phrases, and ideas have been attached to people who never actually said them. How many identities have been shaped not by actions, but by stories. You take a slow breath. This pattern, it's undeniable now. History doesn't just record events. It edits them, simplifies them, sometimes even rewrites them. Not always intentionally, but inevitably. You gently place the book back on the shelf. Marie Antoinette remains there, forever linked to a sentence that defined her in the eyes of millions, even if it was never hers to begin with. And as you step forward once again, the hallway stretching endlessly ahead, you can't help but feel a quiet realization settling in. Sometimes, the most famous lines in history were never spoken at all. You keep moving, and the hallway shifts again, this time into something quieter, more modern, almost familiar in a different way. The shelves here aren't ancient wood anymore. They're cleaner, sharper. The books look newer, the pages less worn. There are sketches of equations on the walls, diagrams, symbols that feel just a little out of reach, like they belong to a world of logic and precision. Science, and right in the center of it all, a face you recognize instantly. Wild hair, thoughtful eyes, a kind of quiet intensity. Albert Einstein, and just like that, another fact pops into your mind. Einstein, the genius who failed math as a child. It's one of those stories people love to repeat, almost like a motivational quote disguised as history. See, even Einstein failed, so you'll be fine. It's comforting, encouraging, and completely wrong. You reach for the book, already knowing what you're about to find. Because by now, you recognize the pattern. A good story doesn't always need to be true. You open the pages, and almost immediately, the myth begins to unravel. Einstein did not fail math. Not as a child, not in school. In fact, it's quite the opposite. From a young age, Einstein showed strong abilities in mathematics and physics. By the time he was a teenager, he had already mastered advanced concepts like calculus, topics that many students don't encounter until much later. So where did this idea come from? You flip a page, your curiosity pulling you deeper. Part of the confusion comes from a misunderstanding about grading systems. At one point, Einstein attended a school in Switzerland where the grading scale was different from what many people expect today. In that system, lower numbers represented higher grades, so when people later looked at his report cards without understanding the system, it looked like he had poor marks. But in reality, he was doing very well. Another small misinterpretation, quietly turning into a global myth. You lean slightly against the shelf, letting that settle. It's almost funny, in a way. One of the greatest scientific minds in history, remembered for something that never happened. But there's more to it than just a grading mix-up. The story also persists because it feels good. It fits a narrative people want to believe. That success doesn't require early brilliance. That struggling in school doesn't define your future. That even the smartest people started off failing. And while that message can be encouraging, attaching it to Einstein doesn't make it more true. There's a mainstream historical fact here that often gets overshadowed. Einstein's contributions to science were groundbreaking. His theory of relativity reshaped our understanding of space, time, and gravity. His work on the photoelectric effect even earned him a Nobel Prize. Not exactly the resume of someone who struggled with basic math. You glance at the equations sketched on the wall. They look complex, almost abstract, and yet, for Einstein, they were a language he understood deeply. There's also a quirky detail hidden in this myth. Einstein himself was aware of the rumor, and he found it amusing. At one point, he reportedly responded to the claim by saying something along the lines of, "I never failed in mathematics. Before I was 15, I had mastered differential and integral calculus." Imagine that, the myth becoming so widespread that even he had to correct it. Scholars still argue whether stories like this gain popularity because they humanize great figures or because they simplify their journeys into something more relatable. Because the real story, it's often more complex, less comforting, more demanding. You close the book halfway, your fingers resting lightly on the page. It makes you think about how we tell stories about intelligence. We like the idea that genius comes from unexpected places, that it hides behind failure, that it emerges suddenly, almost magically. But in reality, it's usually built over time, through curiosity, through effort, through persistence, not failure, but growth. You take a slow breath, the quiet hum of the hallway returning. This myth feels different from the others, less about dramatic events and more about identity, about how we shape the image of a person to fit a narrative. Einstein becomes not just a scientist, but a symbol of hope, of possibility. And to make that symbol work, the story gets adjusted, just a little, enough to make it more inspiring. Even if it's not accurate, you glance back at the portrait, the wild hair, the thoughtful eyes. He doesn't look like someone who failed. He looks like someone who questioned everything, which, in a way, connects back to you, because that's what you're doing now. Questioning, looking at familiar stories and asking, is this really how it happened? You gently slide the book back into place. Einstein remains brilliant, curious, and perhaps a little misunderstood, not because of his work, but because of the stories told about him. And as you move forward once again, the corridor stretching endlessly ahead, you realize something. Sometimes, we don't just misunderstand history. We reshape it to make ourselves feel better. And in doing so, we lose a little bit of the. You move deeper still, and the hallway begins to change in a subtle but noticeable way. The shelves grow older again, but not in the dramatic, ancient sense from before. These feel quieter, simpler, less adorned. The lighting dims just a little more, like the space itself is trying to convince you that what lies ahead belongs to a time of emptiness, a time of darkness. And then you see the phrase, the Dark Ages. It's almost impossible not to recognize it. You've heard it in school, in documentaries, maybe even casually in conversations. The idea that after the fall of the Roman Empire, Europe entered a long period of decline. A time when knowledge was lost, progress stalled, and civilization kind of just stumbled around in the dark. It's such a strong image. Cold castles, empty streets, people living in ignorance, waiting for the Renaissance to bring light back. But as you step closer, something feels off. You already know the pattern now. So you reach for the book, and slowly, carefully, you open it. Because the truth is, the Dark Ages weren't really that dark. At least, not in the way the phrase suggests. You pause. That might feel strange, because the term itself implies a complete absence of progress. But history rarely works like that. The phrase, Dark Ages, was actually popularized much later, during the Renaissance. Thinkers of that time looked back at the period after Rome's fall and saw it as a kind of cultural gap, a time when classical knowledge seemed less visible compared to the flourishing of art and science they were experiencing. So they labeled it dark. But that label says more about their perspective than the reality of the time. You flip a page. After the fall of the Western Roman Empire in 476 CE, Europe did go through significant changes. Political structures shifted, trade networks weakened in some regions, certain urban centers declined, but that doesn't mean everything stopped. Far from it. There's a mainstream historical fact that often gets overlooked. During this period, many important developments were still happening. Agricultural techniques improved. The heavy plow, for example, allowed farming in tougher soils. New methods of crop rotation increased food production. Monasteries became centers of learning, where texts were copied and preserved. Without them, many classical works might have been lost entirely. And beyond Europe, in places like the Islamic world, there was a flourishing of science, mathematics, and philosophy, often building on and preserving knowledge from earlier civilizations. So the world wasn't dark. It was changing. You lean slightly against the shelf, letting that idea settle. Because calling it the Dark Ages makes it sound like a pause in history. But history doesn't pause. It shifts. It evolves in ways that aren't always immediately visible. There's also a quirky detail hidden in this myth. The term, Dark Ages, originally referred not to a lack of progress, but to a lack of written records from certain periods. In other words, it was dark because historians had less information, not because people at the time were living in darkness. Imagine that, a label based on our limited knowledge being mistaken for a description of their reality. That's a pretty big difference. Scholars still argue whether the term should be used at all. Many prefer alternatives like early Middle Ages because they feel it avoids the negative and misleading connotations. Because words matter a lot, you close the book halfway, your mind drifting through the imagery you've always associated with this era. Cold, gray, empty. But now, it feels different. You start to see movement. Farmers working fields, monks copying manuscripts by candlelight, traders traveling between regions, builders constructing early forms of what would become iconic medieval architecture. Life continuing, adapting, not glamorous, maybe, not as celebrated as the Renaissance, but not dark. You take a slow breath, the soft hum of the hallway wrapping around you again. It's interesting how easily a label can shape perception. Say, Dark Ages, and people imagine decline, ignorance, stagnation. Say, Early Middle Ages, and suddenly it feels more neutral. More open to interpretation, same period, different story. You glance around the shelves. They don't feel as dim anymore, not because the lighting changed, but because your understanding did. And that's something you're starting to notice more and more. These myths don't just alter facts. They alter feelings. They shape how you imagine the past, how you picture entire centuries in your mind. And once that image forms, it's hard to replace. You gently slide the book back into place. The Dark Ages remain still widely used, still deeply embedded in language, but now a little less solid, a little more questionable. As you step forward again, deeper into the corridor, you can feel it, that steady rhythm of realization. Story after story, myth after myth, each one peeling back another layer. And with each step, the past becomes less like a fixed timeline and more like a living, shifting narrative. You step forward again, and the hallway tightens, not in space, but in intensity. The shelves here feel heavier. Darker wood, rough edges, the kind of place where stories aren't just told, they're survived. You notice something else too. The imagery has changed. No more elegant portraits or polished maps. Instead, you see shields, spears, harsh landscapes, figures standing in formation, silent but imposing, warriors, and then a number appears in your mind almost instantly. 300. You don't even need to think about it. Spartans, strong, fearless, unbreakable, standing alone against an overwhelming enemy, choosing death over surrender. It's one of the most iconic stories in history. The Battle of Thermopylae. You can see it clearly. The narrow pass, the dust in the air, the sound of marching armies, and a small group of elite warriors holding the line against thousands. The lone, always, the lone. You reach for the book slowly, almost carefully, because this story feels sacred in a way, untouchable. But by now, you know better. You open the pages, and just like that, the image begins to shift. Because the Spartans weren't alone, not even close. You pause, letting that sink in. At the Battle of Thermopylae in 480 BCE, King Leonidas I did indeed lead 300 Spartan soldiers. That part is true, but they were part of a much larger Greek force. Estimates vary, but thousands of other Greek troops were present, Thespians, Thebans, and soldiers from various city-states who stood alongside the Spartans. Fighting, holding the line, dying. You lean slightly closer to the page. So why does the story focus almost entirely on the 300? Why does it feel like they were the only ones there? You turn a page, and the answer begins to take shape. Spartans had a reputation. They were elite warriors, trained from a young age, disciplined, feared. Their society revolved around military strength. So when they made a stand, it meant something. It symbolized resistance, courage, sacrifice, and over time, that symbol grew larger than the full story. There's also a key moment that often gets simplified. When the Persians eventually found a way around the pass, King Leonidas dismissed most of the Greek forces. But not all. Some stayed. Notably, around 700 Thespians chose to remain and fight to the end alongside the Spartans. Voluntarily. No orders, no obligation, just a decision. And yet, they're rarely mentioned. You let that sit for a moment, because it changes the story, doesn't it? It's no longer just 300 Spartans standing alone. It's a coalition, a shared stand, multiple groups choosing to resist, even when the outcome seemed inevitable. More complex, less clean, but also more human. There's a mainstream historical fact here that often gets overshadowed. The Battle of Thermopylae, while a loss for the Greeks in that moment, played a crucial role in slowing down the Persian advance and boosting morale across Greek city-states. It wasn't just about heroism, it was strategic, but strategy doesn't always make the story more memorable. Heroism does. You glance up from the book, your mind replaying the familiar image. 300 warriors, alone against thousands. Even now, knowing the truth, that version still feels stronger. More dramatic. There's also a quirky detail hidden in this myth. The phrase often associated with the Spartans, "Come and take them," in response to a demand to surrender their weapons, has become legendary. But like many ancient quotes, its exact wording and context are debated. It's another example of how language evolves alongside the story, becoming sharper, more iconic, over time. Scholars still argue whether the emphasis on the 300 Spartans is purely a result of storytelling tradition, or if it reflects a deeper tendency to focus on a single, clear symbol rather than a complex group effort. Because one number is easier to remember than many, one image is easier to hold onto than several overlapping ones, you close the book halfway, your fingers resting on the edge. It's interesting how this works. We don't just simplify events. We spotlight them, shine a light on one part of the story, while the rest fades into the background. Not erased, just less visible. You take a slow breath, the quiet hum of the hallway returning. The Spartans were real. Their stand was real. Their courage, undeniable. But they weren't alone. And somehow, that detail slipped away, replaced by something cleaner. Something more iconic. You gently slide the book back into place. The number 300 lingers in your mind, still powerful, still unforgettable, but now, just a little less complete. As you step forward again, deeper into the corridor, you can feel it. That growing awareness, that quiet understanding that every story has layers. And sometimes, the most important ones are the easiest to miss. You move ahead, and the hallway grows colder again, not with fear this time, but with something quieter. More clinical, almost mechanical. The shelves here are different, metal edges, clean lines, a kind of precision that feels deliberate. Like everything here has been reduced to systems, processes, outcomes. And then you see it, a single object displayed more prominently than the rest. A blade, long, angled, suspended in a frame that feels both elegant and unsettling. The guillotine. Instantly, your mind fills in the story. A swift fall, a clean cut, immediate death. It's often described as merciful, in a way, a more humane method of execution compared to what came before. Quick, efficient, painless. That's the image, that's the belief. But as you step closer, something feels off. You already know what that means. You reach for the book beside it and open it slowly. Because the truth isn't quite that simple. The guillotine was designed to be efficient, yes. It was introduced during the French Revolution as a method intended to provide equal and relatively humane execution, regardless of social class. No more drawn-out punishments. No more variation based on status. Just one clean motion. There's a mainstream historical fact here. The guillotine became widely used during the Reign of Terror, a period of intense political upheaval where thousands of people were executed. It was seen as a symbol of both justice and fear. But here's where the story begins to shift. The idea that the guillotine caused instant, completely painless death. That's still debated. You pause, because this is where things get uncomfortable. Without going into anything graphic, there have been historical accounts and later discussions suggesting that consciousness might not vanish immediately after the blade falls. Some reports, though not universally accepted, describe brief moments where facial reactions or awareness may have persisted for a few seconds. Scholars still argue whether these observations were accurate, exaggerated, or misunderstood. Because measuring consciousness in such a situation, especially with the knowledge available at the time, is incredibly difficult. But the possibility alone changes the perception. You lean back slightly, your eyes drifting to the blade again. It doesn't feel as clean anymore, not as simple, because what was meant to be a humane solution might not have been as perfect as it seemed. There's also a subtle irony here. The guillotine was introduced during a time when people were trying to make systems more rational, more equal, more fair. It was, in a way, a product of Enlightenment thinking, applying logic and uniformity even to something as grim as execution. But reality doesn't always follow clean lines. There's a quirky detail tucked into this story as well. The guillotine didn't just disappear after the French Revolution. It continued to be used in France for many years afterward. In fact, the last execution by guillotine in France took place in 1977. Not centuries ago, within living memory. That realization lingers for a moment, because it pulls the story out of the distant past and places it closer to the present than you might expect. You close the book halfway, your fingers resting lightly on the page. It's interesting how this myth works. The guillotine isn't entirely misunderstood. It was faster than many methods that came before it. It was intended to be more humane. But somewhere along the way, more humane became completely painless. And that shift matters, because it turns a complex reality into a comforting assumption. You take a slow breath, the cool air of the hallway settling around you. This isn't just about the guillotine. It's about how we simplify uncomfortable truths. We take something complicated, something uncertain, and smooth out the edges. Make it easier to process, easier to accept, even if that means losing some of the truth. You glance once more at the blade. It hangs there silently, unchanged, a symbol of progress and its limits. You gently slide the book back into place, and as you step forward again, deeper into the corridor, you can feel it. That quiet shift continuing, story by story, myth by myth, each one revealing that the past isn't just a collection of events, but a series of interpretations. And sometimes, those interpretations are just a little too neat to be entirely real. You keep walking, and the hallway softens again. The cold, metallic feeling fades into something warmer, more ordinary. The shelves here look lived in, almost domestic. Wooden tubs, small tools, scraps of cloth, objects that feel less like history and more like daily life. And then, without even trying, your mind fills in another familiar image. Medieval people, dirty, unwashed, covered in grime. You've probably heard it before. That people in the Middle Ages barely bathe. That hygiene was almost non-existent. That entire city smelled unbearable, and cleanliness just wasn't a priority. It's such a common idea that it barely feels like a myth. It just feels obvious. But as you reach for the book, that quiet doubt returns once again. Because by now, you expect it. You open the pages slowly. And almost immediately, the story starts to change. Medieval people did bathe, not in the exact same way we do today, not with modern plumbing or daily routines as we know them, but the idea that they completely ignored hygiene. That's not accurate. You pause, letting that settle. Because this one challenges something deeper than just a fact. It challenges an entire feeling about the past. You turn a page. In many medieval towns and cities, public bathhouses were actually quite common, especially in earlier parts of the Middle Ages. People would visit these places to wash, relax, and even socialize. It wasn't just about cleanliness. It was part of community life. You leaned slightly closer, curious. Bathing wasn't necessarily a daily habit for everyone, but it also wasn't rare or avoided. Many people washed their hands and faces regularly, and some bathed more fully depending on access to water and local customs. There's a mainstream historical fact here that often gets overlooked. Medieval societies had varying standards of hygiene depending on region, class, and time period. In some places, cleanliness was even associated with moral or spiritual well-being. Not exactly the image of total neglect. You run your fingers lightly along the edge of the page. So where did this idea come from? Why do we picture the Middle Ages as so dirty? You flip another page. Part of the answer lies in comparison. When later periods, especially during the Enlightenment and Industrial Age, looked back at the Middle Ages, they often saw it as a time of backwardness. Emphasizing poor hygiene became a way of highlighting how much progress had been made. It's a pattern you've seen before. One era defining itself by making the previous one seem worse. There's also another layer to it. During certain times, especially after outbreaks of disease like the Black Death, public bathhouses declined in popularity in some regions. Concerns about illness, changing social norms, and even moral attitudes led to shifts in behavior. So yes, hygiene practices changed, but they didn't disappear entirely. They evolve. You pause, thinking about how easily that nuance gets lost. Sometimes less frequent bathing turns into never bathed. Varied hygiene practices becomes everyone was filthy. It's a simplification, a distortion. You close the book halfway, your mind replaying the familiar stereotype. Dark streets, dirty faces, a world that feels almost unlivable. But now, that image feels exaggerated, incomplete. There's also a quirky detail tucked into this myth. Some medieval people used herbs and flowers to freshen their surroundings or even themselves. Fragrances, basic grooming, and attention to appearance were still part of daily life, especially among certain social groups. It's not exactly modern hygiene, but it's also far from total neglect. Scholars still argue whether the stereotype of medieval dirtiness says more about the past or about how later generations wanted to view it. Because sometimes, exaggerating the flaws of the past makes the present feel more advanced, more comfortable. You take a slow breath, the warmth of this section of the hallway settling around you. It's becoming clearer now. These myths don't just misrepresent events or people. They reshape entire eras. They take complex, varied realities and compress them into a single, easily digestible idea. In this case, dirty, unclean, primitive, even if that's not the full story. You glance around the shelves again. The objects here don't feel as distant anymore. They feel relatable, human, because at the end of the day, people in the past weren't that different. They cared about comfort, about health, about how they looked and felt. Just like you gently place the book back on the shelf. The myth lingers, of course. It always does. But now, it feels a little less solid, a little more open to question. And as you step forward once again, deeper into the corridor, you carry that understanding with you, that even the most ordinary assumptions about the past can turn out to be surprisingly misleading. You move forward again, and the hallway shifts into something softer, almost comforting. Warm light flickers along the walls. The shelves here feel less heavy, less intense, filled with images of gatherings, shared meals, and quiet moments of connection. There's laughter here, or at least, the memory of it. And then, almost instantly, a familiar scene forms in your mind. A long wooden table, people sitting together, pilgrims and Native Americans, sharing food, smiling, united in peace. The first Thanksgiving, it's one of those stories that feels simple, warm, almost perfect, a moment of harmony in an otherwise difficult time. You've probably seen it in books, movies, maybe even reenacted in school. But as you step closer, something about it feels too neat, too complete. You reach for the book slowly, because by now, you know exactly what that means. You open it, and gently, quietly, the edges of the story begin to blur. There was a gathering in 1621 between English settlers, often called pilgrims, and members of the Wampanoag people. That part is real. It took place in what is now Plymouth. It involved shared food. It lasted for several days. There's your mainstream historical fact. But everything else, that's where things get more complicated. You pause, letting the warmth of the hallway settle around you. Because this isn't just about facts. It's about perspective. You turn the page. The event wasn't originally called Thanksgiving. It wasn't a national holiday. It wasn't even necessarily seen, at the time, as a symbolic moment of unity. It was more practical. A harvest celebration. A moment of relative peace between two groups who, for very different reasons, were navigating survival. You lean slightly closer. The Wampanoag people didn't simply join a friendly feast in the way it's often portrayed. Their presence may have been influenced by the sound of gunfire, possibly signaling celebration or alert. And while there was cooperation at that moment, the broader relationship between Native Americans and European settlers was far more complex and often far more difficult than this single scene suggests. You let that sit for a moment, because it changes the tone entirely. The story shifts from a perfect snapshot of harmony to a brief moment within a much larger, more complicated reality. There's also a subtle detail that often gets overlooked. The foods at that gathering were likely very different from what modern Thanksgiving tables look like. No mashed potatoes, no cranberry sauce as we know it, no pumpkin pie in the familiar sense. Instead, it was a mix of local game, corn, and other foods available at the time. It's a small detail, but it reminds you how easily modern traditions get projected backward, reshaping the past to match the present. You close the book halfway, your fingers resting lightly on the page. So how did this version of the story become so widespread? Why does it feel so polished? You turn one more page. Over time, especially in the 19th century, the idea of Thanksgiving was reshaped into a national narrative, something that could unify people, tell a positive origin story, and emphasize cooperation. It became symbolic, and symbols tend to simplify. They highlight the hopeful parts, the comforting parts, even if that means leaving out the more complicated ones. There's a quirky detail tucked into this myth as well. The image of pilgrims wearing black clothing with tall hats and buckles. That's largely a later invention. Their actual clothing was more varied and practical, but the simplified image stuck, because it's easier to recognize, easier to remember. Scholars still argue whether the traditional Thanksgiving story should be seen as a harmless cultural myth, or as a narrative that oversimplifies and obscures important historical realities. Because on one hand, it brings people together. On the other, it leaves things out. Important things. You take a slow breath, the warmth of the scene lingering around you. It's not that the gathering didn't happen. It did, and for a brief moment, there was cooperation. But the story you've been told, it's just one version, one angle, polished over time until it feels almost too perfect. You glance once more at the imagined table. The laughter, the shared meal, it's still a powerful image, still meaningful, but now it feels a little more fragile, a little more incomplete. You gently place the book back on the shelf, and as you step forward again, deeper into the corridor, you carry that awareness with you, that even the warmest stories can have edges that were quietly smoothed away. You move on, and the warmth of shared meals slowly fades into something louder, heavier. The air feels charged again. You hear it before you see it. A distant roar, echoing footsteps, the metallic clash of something sharp meeting something solid. The hallway opens into a wider space now, stone walls rising higher, torches flickering against rough surfaces. An arena, and immediately, the image forms in your mind. Two gladiators standing across from each other, weapons drawn, crowds screaming, and only one walks out alive. It's brutal, final, absolute. That's the version you've seen again and again. Gladiators fought to the death every time, but as you take a step closer, something in that certainty begins to loosen. You already know the pattern. You reach for the book resting near the edge of the arena wall. And as you open it, the noise softens. Not gone, just more controlled, because the reality isn't as simple as constant death. Gladiators were fighters, yes, but they were also investments. Many of them were trained professionals, owned or managed by individuals who had spent time, money, and effort preparing them for combat, and losing a trained gladiator in every fight. That wouldn't make much sense. You pause, letting that logic settle, because it changes the entire dynamic. Fights were dangerous, there's no denying that. Injuries happened, deaths did occur, but not every match ended with someone dying. In fact, many fights likely ended with one gladiator yielding, the outcome decided by the crowd or the organizer. There's a mainstream historical fact here. Gladiatorial games were a form of public entertainment in ancient Rome, often sponsored by wealthy individuals or political leaders to gain favor with the public. They were spectacles, carefully organized, designed to entertain, not just to kill. You glance back toward the imagined arena. It feels different now, less like chaos, more like performance. You turn a page. Some gladiators became quite famous, even admired. They had fan followings, reputations, and in some cases, opportunities to earn freedom after years of fighting. It wasn't just survival, it was a career, dangerous, yes, but structured. There's also a system behind it. Referees were present in matches. Rules existed. Certain types of gladiators fought in specific pairings to create balanced and interesting contests. It wasn't random violence, it was controlled combat. You lean slightly closer, absorbing the shift. So where does the fight to the death every time idea come from? You flip another page. Part of it comes from dramatic storytelling. Moments where a defeated gladiator might be spared or executed, depending on the will of the crowd or the host, became symbolic. Those high-stakes decisions stood out, and over time, they came to represent the entire system. There's also a quirky detail hidden here. The famous gesture often shown, thumbs up for life, thumbs down for death, isn't as clear-cut as popular culture suggests. Historians still debate what gestures were actually used and what they meant. It's another example of how small details get reshaped into something more definite, more cinematic. Scholars still argue whether gladiatorial combat was more about brutality or about ritualized performance within a structured system of rules and expectations. Because it was likely both. But the balance between those two ideas, that's where interpretation comes in. You close the book slowly, your fingers resting on its worn edge. The arena around you feels quieter now. Still intense, still dangerous, but not as relentlessly fatal as you once imagined. You can almost see it differently now, not just as a place of death, but as a stage, a place where skill, endurance, and reputation mattered, where survival wasn't guaranteed, but it also wasn't impossible. You take a slow breath, the echoes fading into the background. This myth, like the others, takes something real and pushes it to an extreme. Because extremes are easier to remember, more dramatic, more engaging, but less accurate, you gently place the book back where it belongs. And as you step forward again, deeper into the corridor, you carry that shift in perspective with you. That even in the loudest, most violent stories, there are layers of control, intention, and structure, quietly hidden beneath the surface. You move forward, and the arena fades behind you. The echoes soften, replaced by something far more still. The hallway narrows again, but this time it feels heavier, not with noise, but with silence. thick, almost oppressive silence. The kind that makes your footsteps feel louder than they should. And then you see it. A tall, iron shape standing at the center of the corridor. Dark, rigid, lined with pointed edges that catch just enough light to make your mind fill in the rest. B. Iron Maiden. Even before you get closer, the story is already there in your head. A medieval torture device, a hollow metal coffin, lined with spikes on the inside, designed to close around a person, causing slow, inevitable death. It's one of the most chilling images associated with the Middle Ages. Cold, calculated, cruel. You've probably seen it in movies, games, maybe even museum displays. It feels real, it looks real, but as you step closer, that quiet uncertainty returns. Because by now, you recognize the pattern. You reach for the book placed beside it, and open it slowly. The truth is stranger than the myth. The Iron Maiden, as it's commonly understood, was likely not a real medieval torture device. You pause, because that's not what you expected. Not at all. There's no strong historical evidence that such devices were actually used during the Middle Ages in the way they're often described. Most of the Iron Maidens that exist today, those displayed in museums or exhibitions, were created much later, often in the 18th or 19th century. Long after the medieval period had ended. You let that sink in, because it changes everything. This terrifying symbol of medieval cruelty might not belong to that era at all. You turn the page. Instead, these devices were likely constructed as a kind of spectacle, a way to represent or even exaggerate the idea of medieval punishment. They weren't necessarily tools of history. They were interpretations of it. There's a mainstream historical fact here. While torture and harsh punishments did exist in medieval Europe, many of the devices we associate with that period have been misunderstood, exaggerated, or even invented later for dramatic effect. The reality was often grim, but not always in the theatrical, elaborate way we imagine. You glance back at the Iron Maiden. It still looks terrifying. That hasn't changed. But now, it feels different. Less like an artifact of the past. More like a story about the past. You run your fingers lightly along the edge of the book. So why does this myth exist? Why create something like this? You turn another page. Part of it comes from fascination. Later generations, especially during periods like the Enlightenment, looked back at the Middle Ages as a time of darkness and brutality. Creating dramatic symbols like the Iron Maiden helped reinforce that image. It made the past feel more distant, more primitive, more extreme. There's also a sense of spectacle to it. The idea of a hidden device, designed with such calculated cruelty, captures attention. It lingers in the imagination, even if it wasn't widely, or ever, used in reality. There's a quirky detail hidden in this myth. One of the most famous Iron Maidens is associated with the city of Nuremberg in Germany, but historians believe it was likely assembled much later as a kind of exhibit, rather than an authentic medieval instrument. It's almost like a prop, but a very convincing one. Scholars still argue whether the Iron Maiden should be seen as a deliberate fabrication, or as a misunderstanding that grew over time through storytelling, misinterpretation, and a fascination with the darker sides of history. Because once an image like that takes hold, it's hard to let go. You close the book slowly, your eyes drifting back to the iron structure. It hasn't changed, still tall, still silent, still unsettling, but now it carries a different weight, not just as a symbol of cruelty, but as a reminder of how easily the past can be reshaped. How objects, real or imagined, can become powerful enough to define an entire era. Even if they don't truly belong to it. You take a slow breath, the silence settling around you again. This myth isn't just about something that didn't exist. It's about how convincing something can feel when it fits the story we expect. The Middle Ages were harsh, so a device like this feels believable, natural, even, and that's exactly why it works. You gently place the book back on the shelf, And as you step forward again, deeper into the corridor, you carry that realization with you, that sometimes the most chilling parts of history aren't the ones that happened, but the ones we believe. You move forward, and the silence of iron and shadow slowly gives way to something looser. The hallway opens again, but this time it feels unpredictable. Uneven wooden planks under your feet, the faint creak of ropes, a distant rhythm, like waves brushing against something hollow. And then you smell it, salt. The air shifts, carrying with it the feeling of open water, vast, restless, and full of stories that don't quite stay still. You don't even need to see it. Your mind fills in the scene instantly. Pirates, not the quiet, realistic kind, but the dramatic ones. Maps marked with a bold red X. Hidden chests buried deep in sand. Gold coins spilling out as someone digs them up after years of secrecy. It's one of the most iconic images tied to piracy. Buried treasure. You can practically picture it. The shovel hitting wood, the lid creaking open, the glow of gold catching the light. It feels like something that must have happened all the time, but as you step closer to the shelf, that familiar doubt rises again. You already know where this is going. You reach for the book and open it. The waves in your mind settle just slightly. Because the truth is, pirates didn't commonly bury treasure. You pause. It's not that it never happened, but it was extremely rare. Far rarer than the stories suggest. You turn the page. Pirates, in reality, operated very differently. They didn't usually sit on large piles of gold waiting to be hidden away. Instead, they tended to divide their loot relatively quickly among the crew. Money, goods, supplies, it was meant to be used. Spent, shared, not buried and forgotten. There's a mainstream historical fact here. Piracy during the so-called Golden Age of piracy, roughly late 1600s to early 1700s, involved seizing goods like sugar, tobacco, textiles, and occasionally coins, not always the glittering piles of gold we imagine. Practical items, trade goods, things that could be exchanged or consumed. You lean slightly closer. So where did the buried treasure idea come from? You flip another page. One of the main reasons is storytelling, especially adventure fiction. The image of hidden treasure adds mystery, suspense, and a clear goal. It turns piracy into a kind of treasure hunt, something exciting, almost playful. Over time, that image became stronger than reality. There is, however, one often cited exception. A pirate named William Kidd is believed to have buried some treasure, possibly as a way to bargain for leniency. But even that case is surrounded by uncertainty and debate. One example turned into a universal idea. You let that sit for a moment, because it's a pattern you've seen before. A rare event becomes the defining image. You glance out toward the imagined sea. It feels different now, less like a treasure map waiting to be solved, more like a harsh, unpredictable life. There's also a quirky detail tucked into this myth. The classic pirate accent, the exaggerated R, that's largely influenced by later performances, especially actors portraying pirates in films and plays. It's not how most real pirates actually spoke, but it's memorable, so it sticks. Scholars still argue whether the romanticized image of pirates, treasure, adventure, freedom, has overshadowed the more complex and often difficult realities of their lives at sea. Because piracy wasn't just adventure, it was risk, uncertainty, and often survival. You close the book slowly, your fingers resting on its edge. The idea of buried treasure still lingers. It's hard to let go of something so vivid, so cinematic, but now it feels more like a story than a standard practice. A symbol, not a rule. You take a slow breath, the scent of salt fading gently. It's interesting how this myth works. It doesn't just change what pirates did, it changes what piracy feels like. From something harsh and unpredictable, to something adventurous and almost magical. You gently place the book back on the shelf, and as you step forward again, deeper into the corridor, You carry that understanding with you. That sometimes the most exciting parts of a story are the ones that happen the least. You keep moving and the salty air fades behind you. The hallway narrows again, but this time it feels tense. Not loud like the arena, not silent like before, but filled with a quiet kind of pressure. Like something important is about to happen. The walls around you begin to shift into stone again. Rough, ancient, narrow. A passage, and once more, without effort, your mind pulls up a familiar image. A small group of warriors, standing against an overwhelming force. 300 Spartans. You pause, because you've already been here, in a way. You've already uncovered the truth that they weren't alone. But as you step forward now, something tells you there's still more to this story. You reach for the book, open it, and the image shifts again, subtly but meaningfully. Because even when we accept that the Spartans weren't alone, we still tend to picture them as the only ones who mattered. The central force, the defining presence, everything else, background. You turn a page slowly. At the Battle of Thermopylae, alongside the 300 Spartans led by Leonidas I, there were thousands of other Greek soldiers at the start. And when the final stand came, when retreat was no longer an option, it wasn't just Spartans who stayed behind. The Thespians, in particular, remained, fought, and died, not because they had to, but because they chose to. You let that settle, because choice changes the story. It adds a layer of meaning that often gets overlooked. There's a mainstream historical fact here. While the Spartans have become the symbol of Thermopylae, other Greek forces, especially the Thespians, played a crucial role in the final defense. They weren't side characters, they were part of the stand. You lean slightly closer to the page. So why did they fade into the background? Why does the number 300 still dominate the story? You flip another page, because stories often look for clarity. A single, powerful image. A number that's easy to remember. 300. It's precise, it's striking, it feels almost mythical. But thousands, that's harder to picture, harder to hold on to. So over time, the story narrows, focus sharpens, and everything else softens at the edges. There's also another layer here. Sparta itself had a reputation that amplified the story. Their training, their discipline, their culture of warfare, it made them the perfect symbol of resistance. So even within a larger group, they stood out, and eventually, they stood alone, at least in the way the story is told. There's a quirky detail hidden in this myth. The idea that Spartans fought without fear, completely unshaken, is often exaggerated. Like any human beings, they would have experienced fear, exhaustion, doubt. But those parts of the story don't get highlighted, because they don't fit the image. Scholars still argue whether the dominance of the 300 Spartans narrative is simply a matter of storytelling efficiency, or a reflection of how history tends to elevate certain groups while minimizing others. Because once a symbol takes hold, it becomes hard to share the spotlight. You close the book slowly, your mind returning to the narrow pass. It looks different now, not empty except for Spartans, but filled with allies, with choices, with shared sacrifice. You can almost see them now, not just a single line of warriors, but a collective stand, messier, more complex, but also more real. You take a slow breath, the tension easing just slightly. It's interesting how even after a myth is corrected, it can still persist in a quieter way. You learn that the Spartans weren't alone, but you still picture them that way. Because the image is strong, familiar, comfortable, you gently place the book back on the shelf. And as you step forward again, deeper into the corridor, you carry that awareness with you. That sometimes, even when the truth is known, the myth doesn't disappear, it just becomes quieter, still shaping the story from beneath the surface. You step forward, and the tension of the narrow pass slowly dissolves into something softer again. Not warm like before, not cold either, just quiet, balanced. The hallway here feels almost elegant. Smooth stone, gentle light, shelves arranged with a kind of deliberate symmetry. And at the center of it, you see a figure. Familiar, recognizable even in silhouette. A queen. Your mind fills in the details instantly. Striking beauty, captivating presence. A woman so attractive that powerful men fell under her spell. Cleopatra. You've heard the story, that her beauty was her greatest weapon, that she charmed leaders like Julius Caesar and Mark Antony, bending history itself through sheer allure. It's one of the most enduring images in history. Cleopatra, the ultimate symbol of beauty and seduction. But as you move closer, something feels incomplete. You already know what that means. You reach for the book resting beside her figure and open it. The image begins to shift, not dramatically, but enough to change everything. Cleopatra was undoubtedly charismatic, intelligent, strategic, but the idea that her power came primarily from physical beauty, that's an oversimplification. You pause, because this myth doesn't just distort facts, it reshapes how a person is remembered. You turn the page. There's a mainstream historical fact here. Cleopatra was highly educated, spoke multiple languages, and was deeply involved in the political and economic strategies of her kingdom. She wasn't just present in history, she actively shaped it. You lean slightly closer. Ancient sources don't consistently describe her as extraordinarily beautiful in a physical sense. Some accounts suggest that her presence, her voice, her intelligence, her ability to engage was far more impactful than her appearance alone. It wasn't just how she looked, it was how she operated. You let that settle, because it changes the narrative entirely. From beauty is power, to intellect is power, strategy is power. There's also something else at play here. You turn another page. Much of what we know about Cleopatra comes from Roman sources, writers who lived in a culture that often portrayed powerful foreign women in particular ways. Framing her as a seductress served a purpose. It simplified her influence, made it easier to explain complex political alliances as something more personal, more emotional, less threatening in a way. You pause, thinking about that, because it's not just about Cleopatra. It's about how stories are shaped by perspective, by who tells them, and why. There's a quirky detail hidden in this myth as well. Some coins and sculptures believed to depict Cleopatra show features that don't match the modern idea of classical beauty. Strong nose, defined chin, distinct, not necessarily perfect by later standards, but distinctive, memorable. Scholars still argue whether Cleopatra's image as a great beauty was amplified over time through literature, art, and later media, or whether her presence simply translated into a kind of attractiveness that's hard to define in purely physical terms. Because beauty, especially across cultures and centuries, is complicated, you close the book slowly, your eyes drifting back to her figure. She feels different now, not diminished, if anything, more powerful, because the story has shifted from something narrow to something deeper, more complete. You take a slow breath, the quiet elegance of the hallway settling around you. It's interesting how this myth works. It doesn't erase Cleopatra's influence, it just reframes it, reduces it to something simpler, easier to understand, but less accurate. You gently place the book back on the shelf, and as you step forward again, nearing the end of the corridor, you carry that realization with you, that sometimes the most influential people in history are remembered not for what they did, but for what makes their story easier to tell. You take another step forward, and the hallway begins to change in a way it hasn't before. Not darker, not brighter, just quieter. The shelves are still there, stretching endlessly on both sides, but now they feel less like separate sections and more like parts of a single, continuous story. You slow down, because something about this space feels like an ending, or maybe a realization. You glance back, just slightly, not to return, but to remember. The Spartans, the gladiators, The pirates, the quiet distortion of everyday life, the powerful figures reshaped into something simpler, cleaner, easier to understand. Each one felt real, each one was real, at least in part, but never quite the way you first imagined. You take a breath, steady and slow, because now, the question isn't just about individual myths. It's bigger than that. Why did these myths exist at all? You reach the final shelf. There's only one book here. You already know you're going to open it. And when you do, the answer doesn't come as a shock. It comes as something familiar. Because myths don't appear out of nowhere. They grow, slowly, quietly. Over time, you turn the first page. One reason is simplicity. Real history is messy, complicated, full of overlapping perspectives, unclear motives, and incomplete records. But stories prefer clarity. A single hero, a single moment, a single version of events. So complexity gets smoothed out. Edges are softened. Details are trimmed away until what remains is something easier to tell and easier to remember. You turn another page. Another reason is repetition. Once a version of a story becomes popular, through books, schools, films, or conversations, it starts to reinforce itself. You hear it again, and again, and again, until it stops feeling like a version and starts feeling like the truth. Even if it began as a simplification or a misunderstanding, you pause, letting that settle, because it explains a lot. You flip the page. There's also intention. Sometimes, stories are shaped for a purpose, to inspire, to unify, to entertain, or even to justify certain perspectives. The Spartans become symbols of courage. The first Thanksgiving becomes a symbol of unity. Cleopatra becomes a symbol of beauty. Each version serves a role, even if it leaves parts of the truth behind. There's a mainstream historical fact woven through all of this. History isn't just recorded, it's interpreted, and those interpretations can shift depending on who is telling the story and why. You close your eyes for a brief moment, because now, it all connects. The myths weren't random, they followed patterns: simplify, repeat, symbolize, and over time, believe. There's a small, almost quiet detail that lingers here, a quirky truth hiding beneath everything. Even when people know a myth isn't entirely accurate, they often still prefer it, because it feels better, stronger, more complete. It fits the way we expect stories to work. Scholars still argue whether these myths should be corrected as much as possible, or whether they serve a purpose in helping people connect with history in a more engaging way. Because without them, history might feel harder to approach, more distant, less alive. You open your eyes again. The hallway feels different now. Not like a place filled with separate stories, but like a single system. A place where truth and storytelling overlap, blend, sometimes blur. You take one final look around. All those shelves, all those books, each one holding a version of the past. Some closer to reality, some shaped by time, all part of the same process. You gently place the final book back, and this time, you don't feel the need to question what comes next. Because the lesson isn't about memorizing which stories are true and which aren't. It's about understanding how stories change, how they're built, how they're passed down. You take a slow step forward, and the hallway begins to fade, not disappearing completely, just softening, like something you're slowly waking up from. And as it does, one thought lingers quietly in your mind. Not every story you've heard is wrong, but very few are complete now. Everything begins to slow. The hallway is gone, or maybe just out of sight, replaced by something softer, something quieter. You're no longer walking, just resting. The ideas are still there, drifting gently through your mind like distant echoes. Spartans standing together, not alone. Gladiators surviving more often than not. Pirates chasing survival instead of burying gold. None of it disappears. It just settles, becomes lighter, easier to hold. You don't need to analyze it anymore. You don't need to question every detail. For now, it's enough to simply let it be. Because history isn't a fixed thing. It moves, it shifts, it reshapes itself with every retelling. And tonight, you've just seen a few of those shifts. Nothing urgent, nothing overwhelming, just quiet understanding. So as your thoughts begin to slow and the edges of these stories soften even further, you can let go of the need to figure everything out. Let the details drift, let the questions fade, and just stay here for a moment, in that calm space between what you thought you knew and what you're still discovering. There's no rush, no pressure, just the quiet hum of everything settling into place. End of script. Sweet dreams.